John Drew Barrymore. John Drew Barrymore had everything a Hollywood dynasty could offer. Fame, talent, and a last name that carried weight. But like his father, the legendary John Barrymore, he had another inheritance: a crippling addiction to alcohol. His career started with promise in the 1950s, landing roles in films like High School Confidential and Never Love a Stranger. Critics saw potential. He had the looks, the pedigree, and flashes of real talent. But behind the scenes, his drinking was already spiraling out of control. By the 1960s, his reputation was in freefall. He was unreliable on set, missing shoots, showing up intoxicated, or disappearing entirely. Directors stopped calling. His behavior turned reckless. Arrests for public drunkenness, altercations, and probation violations became routine. In one infamous incident, he was jailed for failing to appear in court, a pattern that repeated throughout his life. By the 1970s, Barrymore was virtually unemployable. His drinking had cost him not just his career, but his relationships. Estranged from his famous family, including his daughter, Drew Barrymore, he drifted into obscurity, at times homeless, at times vanishing for years. He died in 2004 at the age of 72, a cautionary tale of Hollywood excess and addiction. His daughter Drew later spoke about his struggles, describing him as a man lost to his demons. He was a mad poet hedonist man-child, she once said, but I understood that he had no family, that he was raised by strangers, that he had no navigation in life. The Barrymore name had once opened doors for him, but in the end it couldn't save him from himself. Arthur Kennedy. Arthur Kennedy was the kind of actor who didn't just play a role, he inhabited it. A 5-time Academy Award nominee, he was a master of nuance, stealing scenes in films like Champion and Trial. But behind that commanding presence was a man slowly losing his grip, one drink at a time. Kennedy's struggles with alcohol weren't as publicized as some of his contemporaries, but they were no less destructive. As the 1950s faded into the 60s, his drinking became impossible to ignore. Directors who once sought him for his intensity began to hesitate. His performances, once razor-sharp, grew inconsistent. Offers dwindled, and the roles that did come his way were a far cry from the powerhouse characters he once embodied. By the 1970s, Hollywood had all but forgotten him. Kennedy withdrew from the industry, retreating into a life of seclusion in Branford, Connecticut. His final years were marked by illness and isolation, his once brilliant career overshadowed by the battle he could never quite win. When he passed away in 1990, it was a quiet end for a man who had once commanded the screen with such force. His legacy remains, but so does the cautionary tale, how even the most gifted performers can be undone by their demons. Gail Russell. Gail Russell was never meant for Hollywood, not in the way the studios wanted her to be. She wasn't a bombshell or a diva. She was a quiet, painfully shy artist who loved to paint, but Paramount Pictures had other plans. In 1942, they signed her at just 18, captivated by her delicate beauty. She had no acting experience, no formal training, and most importantly, no confidence. On set, Russell was paralyzed by fear. Her anxiety was so overwhelming that she struggled to deliver lines, her voice barely above a whisper. The solution? A drink. Just one to steady her nerves. But one became 2, then 3, until alcohol became her crutch. By the time she starred alongside John Wayne in Angel and the Bad Man in 1947, she was already battling a growing dependence. Hollywood is ruthless to those who can't keep up. By the early 1950s, Russell's drinking was no longer a secret. She was arrested multiple times for driving under the influence, her once promising career crumbling with each mugshot. Studios stopped calling. She lost her home, her money, and eventually her health. On August 26, 1961, Gail Russell was found dead in her Los Angeles apartment. She was just 36. The official cause? A heart attack, but years of alcohol abuse had ravaged her body. Empty liquor bottles surrounded her, a tragic testament to the addiction that had stolen her career, her future, and ultimately her life. Barbara Payton. Hollywood had never seen anyone quite like Barbara Payton. In the late 1940s, she was the embodiment of a studio executive's dream. Blonde, blue-eyed, and impossibly charismatic. She had the kind of beauty that could stop a casting director mid-sentence, and for a brief, incandescent moment, it seemed like she was destined for stardom. Warner Brothers signed her to a contract in 1949, and she quickly landed leading roles opposite A-listers like James Cagney and Gary Cooper. But behind the camera, Payton's life was unraveling at a terrifying speed. Alcohol wasn't just a vice for Payton, it was the fuse to a slow-burning explosion. By the early 1950s, her drinking had spiraled into full-blown self-destruction. She became notorious for violent altercations, including a scandalous love triangle with actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. In 1951, Neal brutally beat Tone into a coma over Peyton, leaving him with permanent facial injuries. The tabloids had a field day, and Hollywood, ever image-conscious, turned its back on her almost overnight. By 1955, Peyton was blacklisted. The glamorous film premieres and studio contracts were gone. In their place were late nights in dive bars, arrests for public intoxication, and, eventually, prostitution just to survive. She was picked up by police multiple times for disorderly conduct, her once stunning face now a ghost of its former self. The industry that had once adored her had moved on, leaving her to fade into obscurity. By the time she died in 1967 at just 39 years old, Peyton was penniless, living in a seedy Los Angeles motel, her body ravaged by years of alcohol abuse. Her story wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a brutal reminder of how quickly Hollywood could chew up and spit out its brightest stars. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake was the kind of star Hollywood dreams are made of, until she became a cautionary tale. In the early 1940s, she was everywhere. That signature peekaboo hairstyle? It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a phenomenon. Women across America copied it, and the government even had to ask her to pin it back during World War II, because factory workers kept getting their hair caught in machines. But beneath the glamour, Lake was already battling demons. By the mid-40s, her drinking was impossible to ignore. Directors complained of her erratic behavior on set, slurred lines, forgotten cues, and a temper that turned co-stars against her. Joel McCrea, her leading man in Sullivan's Travels, reportedly refused to work with her again, calling her a pain in the neck. As the roles dried up, so did the patience of Hollywood's power players. By the 50s, she was effectively blacklisted. Without steady work, Lake spiraled. She was arrested multiple times for public drunkenness, her once glamorous image reduced to tabloid fodder. In a shocking turn, she ended up working as a hotel maid in New York City, a far cry from the silver screen. When a reporter tracked her down in the 60s, she admitted she was barely scraping by. By the time she died in 1973, at just 50 years old, cirrhosis had ravaged her body. Hollywood had long since moved on, and her death barely made headlines. But for those who remembered, Veronica Lake was more than just a fallen star. She was a symbol of how quickly Hollywood could turn its back on its own. Broderick Crawford. Broderick Crawford was the kind of actor who could command a room with just his voice, a gravelly, no-nonsense growl that made him perfect for tough, authoritative roles. In 1949, he delivered the performance of a lifetime as the corrupt politician Willie Stark in All the King's Men, a role that won him an Academy Award for Best Actor. But off-screen, Crawford was battling an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver: alcohol. By the early 1950s, Crawford's drinking was more than just a bad habit. It was a liability. He was arrested multiple times for public intoxication and reckless driving, his name appearing in police blotters almost as often as it did in film credits. Hollywood, always wary of unpredictability, began to back away. Directors who once clamored to work with him now hesitated, unsure if he'd even show up to set sober. As the film offers dried up, Crawford found a second act in television, starring in Highway Patrol from 1955 to 1959. The irony was cruel. He played a no-nonsense lawman while struggling with his own run-ins with the police. By the 1960s, his career was in freefall. He still found work, but the prestige was gone. The roles were smaller, the productions cheaper, and the respect he once commanded had faded. Crawford's drinking never truly stopped, and it took a toll on his health. By the time he died in 1986, his legacy was a cautionary tale, proof that even an Oscar couldn't save a man from his own demons. Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell captivated audiences in the 1940s with her striking beauty and undeniable talent. But behind the glamour of films like Forever Amber lay a life unraveling at the seams. Married at just 16 to her much older manager, Peveril Marley, Darnell endured an abusive relationship that left lasting scars. As the pressures of Hollywood mounted, she turned to alcohol, a crutch that soon became a cage. By the early 1950s, the roles that once came easily began to dry up. Studios saw her as unreliable, her drinking fueling erratic behavior on set. She found herself trapped in a vicious cycle. The more she drank, the fewer opportunities she had, The fewer opportunities, the deeper she sank into the bottle. Once a sought-after leading lady, she was now struggling to find work, appearing in low-budget films and television just to stay afloat. Then came the tragic final chapter. On April 10th, 1965, Darnell was staying at a friend's house in Illinois when a fire broke out. Some reports suggest she had been drinking that evening, though this remains speculative. Trapped in the blaze, she suffered fatal burns and died the next day at just 41. A career that had once soared had long since crumbled, and in the end, her demons consumed her. Darnell's story is one of raw talent undone by personal turmoil, a cautionary tale of how Hollywood's brightest stars can burn out far too soon. Tom Conway. Tom Conway had it all. The suave British accent, the leading man looks, and a Hollywood career that, for a time, seemed unstoppable. In the 1940s, he stepped into the shoes of the Falcon, a role his own brother, George Sanders, had made famous. Conway played the debonair detective in 10 films, cementing his place as a reliable star of the era. But behind the charm and effortless screen presence, Conway was battling a demon that would eventually strip him of everything: alcohol. By the early 1950s, the cracks were showing. His increasing dependence on alcohol led to erratic behavior on set, missed calls, and a reputation that made studios wary. Hollywood is a town that thrives on reliability, and Conway was becoming anything but. His once promising career began to slip away. He took on lower budget films, then television roles, but even those opportunities dried up as his drinking worsened. The downward spiral wasn't just professional, it was personal. Conway was frequently arrested for public intoxication, his name appearing in police blotters more often than in film credits. Financial struggles followed, and by the 1960s he was living in near destitution, relying on the kindness of friends to get by. One of those friends was fellow actor Ben Johnson, who reportedly helped Conway find shelter when he had nowhere else to go. By the time he died in 1967, at the age of 62, Conway was a shadow of the man who had once graced the silver screen. Penniless and largely forgotten by the industry that once embraced him, his story became another cautionary tale of Hollywood's unforgiving nature. The town that builds legends rarely looks back when they fall. Jackie Gleason. Jackie Gleason was a force of nature, larger than life in every way. On screen, he was the bombastic, wisecracking Ralph Cramden in The Honeymooners, a role that made him one of television's first megastars. Off-screen, he was just as intense, but his passion came in a glass. Gleason's drinking wasn't just a habit, it was a spectacle. He was known to down entire bottles of whiskey before performances, sometimes even sneaking drinks between takes. Co-stars marveled at how he could hold his liquor and still deliver his lines flawlessly. But behind the scenes, the cracks were showing. His drinking fueled erratic mood swings, weight gain, and a reputation for being difficult to work with. Directors never knew if they'd get the charming, quick-witted Gleason or the belligerent, unpredictable one. His personal life suffered too. His marriages crumbled under the weight of his drinking, and colleagues found themselves on the receiving end of his temper more often than not. By the time he reached his later years, the damage was undeniable. Years of alcohol abuse had taken a brutal toll on his health, leading to diabetes, phlebitis, and eventually colon cancer. When he passed away in 1987, the man who had once filled rooms with laughter was a shadow of himself, his body ravaged by decades of excess. W.C. Fields. W.C. Fields was a master of comedic timing, a vaudeville legend who conquered Hollywood with his biting wit and razor-sharp delivery. But behind the scenes, he was locked in a battle with alcohol that would ultimately destroy him. Fields didn't just drink. He built his entire persona around it. His characters were often lovable scoundrels with a drink in hand, slurring their way through absurd situations. He even joked about it off-screen, famously saying, "I always keep a bottle of whiskey handy in case I see a snake, which I also keep handy." But the humor masked something darker. Fields' drinking wasn't just an act, it was relentless. By the 1930s, he was consuming staggering amounts of alcohol daily. His biographer, James Curtis, estimated that Fields could put away 2 quarts of martinis in a single sitting. His dependence on alcohol became so severe that he began hiding bottles around his home, even in the hollowed-out legs of furniture. By the 1940s, the effects were undeniable. His once brilliant comedic timing dulled, his speech slurred, and his health deteriorated. He suffered from cirrhosis, a condition that left him weak and in constant pain. Studios, once eager to work with him, started to back away. His final years were a shadow of his former glory, battling illness, struggling to find work, and drinking until the very end. On December 25, 1946, W.C. Fields died at the age of 66, his body ravaged by years of alcohol abuse. The man who made millions laugh couldn't outrun the one vice that ultimately took everything from him. Ray Milland. Ray Milland's performance in The Lost Weekend was so raw, so painfully real that audiences in 1945 were left shaken. His portrayal of an alcoholic spiraling into self-destruction won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. But what they didn't know was that Milland wasn't just acting. His own battle with alcohol was playing out behind the scenes. Unlike the tortured, down-and-out writer he played on screen, Milland maintained a polished Hollywood image. He was the suave leading man, the embodiment of old-school charm. But off-camera, alcohol slowly tightened its grip. At first, it was the social drinking expected of a golden age star. Cocktail parties, studio functions, the occasional late-night bender. But as the years passed, the drinking became less about celebration and more about escape. By the 1950s, the cracks were showing. His once prominent film roles dwindled and his reputation for reliability took a hit. The studios, once eager to cast him as a dashing hero, started offering him second-rate scripts. By the 1960s, he was mostly relegated to B-movies and television, far from the prestige of his Oscar-winning days. Milland later admitted that alcohol nearly destroyed his career and personal life. He managed to regain some control, but the damage was done. The Hollywood that once adored him had moved on, and he spent his later years in smaller roles, a cautionary tale of how quickly the industry could turn its back. His story wasn't unique. Many stars of his era fell victim to the same cycle, but it was particularly tragic given that his most famous role was a mirror to his own downfall. Gig Young. Gig Young had it all: charm, talent, and an Oscar-winning career. But behind the Hollywood gloss, his life was unraveling. By the time he won Best Supporting Actor for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? In 1969, his drinking had already cost him marriages, roles, and credibility. His fourth wife, Elaine Williams, later reflected on that moment, saying, what he was aching for as he walked up to collect his Oscar was a role in his own movie, one that they could finally call a Gig Young movie. For Young, the Oscar was literally the kiss of death, the end of the line. And she wasn't wrong. His drinking, long a problem, now controlled him. Directors who once sought him out began firing him. In 1973, he landed a role in Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, but on his first day of shooting, he collapsed, alcohol withdrawal. Brooks had no choice but to let him go. The industry took note, and soon, Young was barely employable. His personal life fared no better. 5 marriages, all marred by drinking and volatility. His final wife, Kim Schmidt, was a young German actress, almost 30 years his junior. They had been married for just 3 weeks when, on October 19, 1978, Young shot her in their Manhattan apartment before turning the gun on himself. No note, no explanation, just a shocking end to a once glittering career. Theories abound about why he did it. Some blame his spiraling alcoholism, others point to career despair. What's clear is that the man who had spent decades charming audiences couldn't outrun his demons. His name, once synonymous with effortless charisma, became a cautionary tale, one of Hollywood's darkest falls from grace. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd was the kind of star Hollywood doesn't make anymore. Stoic, golden-haired, and carved straight out of the American myth. In Shane, his most iconic role, he embodied the lone gunslinger, a man of few words but unwavering strength. Off-screen, though, Ladd was fighting a battle no six-shooter could win. Born in 1913, Ladd's childhood was marked by hardship. His father died when he was just 4, and his mother struggled with alcoholism, an ominous foreshadowing of his own future. He was small for his age, earning him the cruel nickname Tiny in school, and that insecurity never quite left him. Even after he became one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the 1940s, he remained haunted by self-doubt. Ladd's drinking started as a social habit, but as the years passed, it became a crutch. Depression and insecurity gnawed at him, and alcohol dulled the edges. By the late 1950s, the polished leading man was slipping. Studios grew hesitant to cast him, his once impeccable image now marred by erratic behavior and a reputation for being unreliable on set. Then came January 29, 1964. Ladd was found dead in his Palm Springs home. The cause? A lethal mix of alcohol and sedatives. Officially ruled an accident, but many close to him weren't so sure. His death was a cruel irony, Hollywood's ultimate tough guy brought down not by bullets, but by the demons he could never outrun. Robert Walker. Robert Walker had the kind of talent that could send chills down your spine. His performance as the charming yet deeply unhinged Bruno Antony in Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train in 1951 was nothing short of mesmerizing. But behind the scenes, Walker was unraveling. His descent into alcoholism wasn't just tragic. It was a slow-motion disaster that Hollywood watched unfold in real time. Walker's troubles began in the late 1940s, when his wife, actress Jennifer Jones, left him for the powerful film producer David O. Selznick. The divorce shattered him. Friends said he was never the same after that. He drank to numb the pain, but the alcohol only fueled violent outbursts that got him blacklisted from studios. By the time he was cast in Strangers on a Train, he was already in and out of psychiatric hospitals, struggling to keep his career afloat. Then came the night of August 28, 1951. Walker, heavily intoxicated, was in the midst of another episode when his doctor administered a sedative to calm him down. Instead, the combination of alcohol and the drug proved fatal. He was just 32 years old, a rising star extinguished in an instant. Walker's death wasn't just a loss for Hollywood, it was a grim reminder of how quickly a promising career could be derailed by addiction. Had he lived, who knows what kind of performances he could have delivered. Instead, he became yet another cautionary tale of talent undone by self-destruction. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy was the kind of actor who made it look effortless, gritty, natural, magnetic, but behind the scenes he was fighting a battle he could never quite win. His drinking was legendary in Hollywood, and not in a glamorous way. Directors learned to work around his binges, sometimes shooting scenes where he barely spoke just to keep him on screen. Katharine Hepburn, his longtime companion, would cover for him, making excuses when he was too sick or too drunk to work. Tracy's alcoholism wasn't just a personal struggle, it was a full-scale war on his body. By the 1950s, he was dealing with diabetes and worsening heart disease, both made worse by decades of heavy drinking. Yet he kept going, delivering powerhouse performances in films like Inherit the Wind and Judgment at Nuremberg. But by the mid-60s, his body was failing. He died in 1967, just days after rapping Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Decades of alcohol abuse had finally caught up with him. His talent was undeniable, but so was the damage left in the wake of his addiction. Franchot Tone. Franchot Tone had it all. The looks, the talent, the charm. In the 1930s, he was Hollywood's quintessential gentleman, starring alongside Clark Gable and Charles Laughton in Mutiny on the Bounty in 1935. But beneath the polished exterior, Tone was battling a demon that would eventually cost him everything: alcohol. By the late 1940s, his drinking had spiraled into violence. The most infamous incident? A brutal brawl with fellow actor Tom Neal over actress Barbara Payton in 1951. Neal, a former boxer, left Tone with a broken nose, a shattered cheekbone, and a concussion so severe he needed plastic surgery. The tabloids had a field day, but the real damage was behind the scenes. Tone's reputation took a hit, and Hollywood grew wary of casting him. As the studio system tightened its grip, stars with off-screen troubles found themselves sidelined. By the 1950s, Tone was mostly relegated to television, his leading man days behind him. He still worked, but the roles were smaller, the spotlight dimmer. His final years were marked by declining health, and when he passed away in 1968, the headlines barely mentioned the matinee idol he once was. Instead, they focused on the scandals, the drinking, and the fight that had become more famous than his films. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.